Two little girls stood in a parking lot on a hot summer afternoon and watched a stranger steal their sister. They saw his face. They described his van. They told the police everything they could remember. And investigators found a single strand of hair inside that van 2 days later, one hair that didn't belong to the little girl who had been taken. That hair sat in a sealed evidence bag inside a state forensic laboratory for 30 years. 30 years of failed DNA tests. 30 years of dead ends. 30 years of a family torn apart by grief and suspicion and unanswered questions. 30 years of a community that never forgot, and never stopped looking. And through all of it, one man sat in a prison cell in Alabama, unknown to investigators in Kentucky and Tennessee, unknown to the family who needed answers, quietly serving time for crimes that had nothing to do with the little girl he had taken, while the people who loved her spent 3 decades waiting for the truth. This is the story of Morgan Jade Violi. She was 7 years old. She loved to dance. She loved to sing. She loved telling her older sisters she was bigger than them, even though she was the youngest. She wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. She never got the chance. If this story already has you leaning forward, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to True Crime Traces right now, hit that notification bell, and drop a like so this case reaches the people who need to hear it. Morgan's story deserves to be told. Let's make sure it is. Morgan Jade Violi was born on November 3, 1988, in Bowling Green, Kentucky, a city of about 50,000 people sitting in the open farmland of south-central Kentucky, roughly 110 miles south of Louisville and 65 miles north of Nashville. She was the youngest of 3 sisters. Her older half-sisters were named Heather and Nikki. Their biological father had died, and a man named Glenn Violi had raised all 3 girls as his own. Morgan's mother, Stacy, would later tell reporters that Morgan was a child full of life, always laughing, always moving, always filling whatever room she was in with noise and energy and joy. She was the kind of kid who made everyone around her smile without even trying. The family lived at the Colony Apartments on Shyv Lane, a low-rise complex on the south side of Bowling Green. By the summer of 1996, Glenn and Stacy's marriage had come apart, and their divorce was working its way through the Warren County courts. On the morning of July 24, 1996, that divorce was finalized. By early afternoon of that same day, Morgan was gone. It was a Wednesday. School was out for the summer. The temperature had pushed up into the 90s. Morgan wasn't supposed to be outside, but the pull of her sisters and friends on a hot summer day was too strong to resist. She slipped out and was walking through the parking lot of the Colony Apartments with a young friend beside her. Heather and Nikki were somewhere nearby, outside in the heat like every other kid in the complex. A maroon van pulled into the parking lot. The man behind the wheel drove slowly past Heather and Nikki. They waved at him, the way you wave at any car passing through. He waved back. Then he circled the lot. He came back around. And at approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, he grabbed Morgan Jade Violi from the sidewalk, threw her into the passenger side of the van, and drove away. Her friend ran screaming. Heather heard the scream and came around in time to see the van pulling out of the lot, with her little sister inside. The whole thing took seconds. One moment Morgan was there, walking through a parking lot on a summer afternoon. The next moment, she was gone. The Bowling Green Police Department responded within minutes and sealed the apartment complex. Officers from across the department and surrounding agencies arrived within the hour. An alert went out through the National Crime Information Center to law enforcement across Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. Agents from the FBI's Louisville field office arrived in Bowling Green that same afternoon and took over coordination of what had immediately become a multi-state search. Heather and Nikki had seen the man's face. They sat down with investigators and described him as clearly as they could: a white male in his 20s, thin, tanned, with shoulder-length brown hair and a sharp, distinct nose. He had been wearing blue jeans and a white t-shirt. A forensic artist at the Kentucky State Police headquarters in Frankfort produced a composite sketch from those descriptions, and within hours it was being distributed across 3 states. 2 days later, on July the 26th, police found the van. It had been abandoned at a Union 76 truck stop in Franklin, Tennessee, in Williamson County, roughly 80 minutes south of Bowling Green. Inside, the FBI recovered a fiber from Morgan's hair that matched the seat cushion material of the van, confirming she had been in that vehicle. But they found something else, too. Something small. Something that would sit at the center of this case for the next 3 decades. A single strand of human hair. One that did not belong to Morgan. 3 months passed. On October the 20th, 1996, a woman walking her property near White House, Tennessee, found the remains of a child in the woods near a barn just off the highway. It was Morgan. The Robertson County medical examiner confirmed the identification. She had been suffocated. She was 7 years old. Her funeral was held at Eastwood Baptist Church in Bowling Green. 500 people came. Pink flowers were placed on top of a small purple coffin, a combination of her favorite colors. Her classmates at Warren Elementary School were told they would never see Morgan again. When the community held a candlelight vigil that ended outside Morgan's apartment building, people left stuffed animals and flowers at the entrance to the parking lot where she had been taken. The grief of an entire city had found a single, quiet place to gather. Morgan's mother said later that 3 or 4 years passed before she and her daughters could even put pictures of Morgan on display in their home. "That's the day I lost my faith in the human race," Stacy said. "I never realized there was anyone that evil who could just take her and do that." In cases of child abduction, investigators almost always look at the parents first. It is painful and necessary work, and in the summer of 1996, the attention turned quickly to Glenn Violi. The timing was almost impossible to ignore. His divorce from Stacy had been finalized in Warren County Court on the very morning Morgan disappeared. Glenn hadn't shown up to the custody hearing. His attorney explained that Glenn didn't need to be there, the arrangements had already been settled beforehand. Glenn said he had gone to work that morning leading a construction crew at a farmhouse near the Tennessee state line and hadn't known he was expected in court. To investigators, the timing looked suspicious. To the community, it looked like guilt. The FBI administered 5 separate polygraph examinations to Glenn Violi over the course of the investigation. He failed all 5 of them. Polygraph results are not admissible in any court of law and are not considered a reliable measure of guilt or innocence. But the results leaked into the community. And once they did, the damage was done. Neighbors stopped speaking to Glenn. Friends disappeared from his life. He couldn't find work. Nobody wanted to hire him. Nobody wanted anything to do with him. He was that man, the one people whispered about. He eventually left Bowling Green altogether and moved to Florida, because nobody in his hometown would give him a chance at a normal life. His own grandfather called him demanding to know where his granddaughter was. His daughters, Heather and Nikki, the 2 girls who had waved at the man in the maroon van that afternoon, grew up carrying the unbearable question of whether the father who had raised them had killed their little sister. Heather would later say that she had seen the man's face that day in the parking lot, and that it had changed her forever. Nikki said she lived with the fear that she might have looked the real killer in the eye at some point in the years that followed, somewhere, at some moment, and never known it. The suspicion tore the family apart from the inside. Glenn cooperated with investigators at every stage. He maintained his innocence through every interview, every polygraph, every conversation. He later said the weight of it had nearly killed him, that he had thought about ending his own life during those years, but had decided it wouldn't make anything better, and it wouldn't bring Morgan back. He worked whatever jobs he could find, wherever he could find them, and he waited for the truth to come out. 2 years after Morgan's abduction, the FBI publicly cleared Glenn Violi and stated he was not a suspect. 2 years. 2 years of having his life dismantled, his business destroyed, his relationships shattered, his own family turned against him, and then a public statement saying he was clear. It didn't undo any of it. The suspicion had already taken root too deep. When public opinion can convince your own children and your own grandparents that you did something like that, he said years later, it's kind of hard to fight that. Meanwhile, the investigation pressed forward on every front it could find. Investigators received more than 1,400 tips in the first 3 months alone. The Bowling Green Police Department, the FBI's Louisville Field Office, the Kentucky State Police, and the Robertson County Sheriff's Office in Tennessee worked as a coordinated task force operating out of Bowling Green. Detectives ran names through federal databases, checked vehicle registrations across 3 states, showed the composite sketch at gas stations and truck stops and bars and restaurants stretching from Kentucky down through Tennessee. They reviewed the fiber evidence from the van. They ran background checks on every registered sex offender within driving distance of Bowling Green and compared their physical descriptions against what Heather and Nikki had reported. The tips kept coming, year after year, because Bowling Green was a close community and people did not forget what had happened to Morgan Jade Violi. An FBI supervisory agent said later that not a single week went by in 30 years without someone calling in information about the case. Investigators followed every lead. None of them identified the man in the van. And all the while, in the Kentucky State Police Forensic Laboratory in Frankfort, roughly 150 miles northeast of Bowling Green, the hair strand from the van sat sealed and waiting. In 1996, DNA technology could not extract a genetic profile from a single, naturally shed strand of hair. The root and follicle tissue needed for analysis simply weren't there, the hair had fallen out on its own, and without the root, there was nothing to work with using the methods that existed at the time. The strand was catalogued, sealed, and placed in storage. In 2003, the FBI laboratory at Quantico tested it. The result was the same, insufficient material for a profile. In 2011, they tried again. The result was the same again. Not enough. The technology needed to read a rootless hair shaft simply did not yet exist. Without a DNA profile from the hair, there was nothing to enter into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. The database can only work when both sides are present, a crime scene profile, and an offender profile to match it against. In most cold cases, the problem is that the killer's DNA was never entered into the system. In Morgan's case, the situation was different in a way that makes it even more painful to sit with. The killer's DNA was already in CODIS. It had been entered under Alabama's mandatory collection program for convicted offenders. The system had his profile, sitting in a database, waiting. But without a crime scene profile to compare it against, there was no match. The system had no way to connect what it knew to the crime it couldn't see. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with the words, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this story. And keep watching, because this is where everything changes. The man who took Morgan Jade Violi had been running from the law for months before he ever reached Bowling Green. In December of 1988, the very same month Morgan was born, he walked into a convenience store on the south side of Montgomery, Alabama, and committed an armed robbery. He was arrested, convicted of first-degree robbery in Montgomery County Circuit Court, and sentenced to a lengthy term in the Alabama prison system. He would spend years inside. During his incarceration, guards found 2 photographs of underage girls in his cell during a routine search. The discovery was documented carefully in his prison file. No additional charges were filed. On April 3, 1996, he escaped from a prison work detail. He stole a car from near the facility. Prison officials later found paperwork in his cell with instructions on how to hotwire vehicles. He fled north and traveled more than 800 miles up the eastern seaboard. Along the way, he robbed an elderly woman and stole her car. He made his way to Mount Carmel, Pennsylvania, a small coal mining town in Northumberland County in the central part of the state. On May 20, 1996, a 7-year-old boy found him sitting inside a children's treehouse in a residential neighborhood in Mount Carmel. Something about the situation felt deeply wrong to the child. He went to his mother and told her. She called police immediately. Officers responded, and when they confronted the man, he ran. They caught him, identified him as the escaped Alabama inmate, and jailed him at the Northumberland County Jail while they arranged for his extradition back to Montgomery. On July 16, 1996, 8 days before Morgan Jade Violi was taken, he escaped from that jail. He climbed a rain spout on the exterior wall of the building and hauled himself up to the roof. He found a cable on the other side and used it to lower himself down into an alley behind the courthouse. He stole a prison employee's bicycle and rode away into the night. By the time jail staff realized he was gone, he had a substantial head start. The U.S. Marshals Service issued a fugitive warrant and entered his name and information into the National Crime Information Center as an escaped prisoner. It was his second escape from custody in just under 3 months. He made his way to Dayton, Ohio, in Montgomery County in southwestern Ohio. His parents lived there. Less than a mile from their house, he stole a maroon 1978 Chevrolet van from a residential street. The owner would not report it missing for several hours. He drove the van south on Interstate 65 through Kentucky. On July 24, 1996, he pulled off the interstate in Bowling Green. He told investigators later that he had exited to buy drugs. He drove into the Colony Apartments parking lot. He saw children playing outside in the summer heat. He circled the lot once. He came back around. And then he reached out and grabbed a 7-year-old girl named Morgan Jade Violi from the sidewalk, threw her into the passenger side of the stolen van, and drove south toward Tennessee. She was crying and screaming. He told her he was taking her to her father, trying to calm her down. She fought him the entire way. He got off the interstate at White House, Tennessee, roughly 30 miles south of Bowling Green. He pulled over near a barn just off the highway. He climbed into the back of the van. He covered Morgan's mouth with his hand, then placed a handkerchief over her mouth and pulled it tight with both hands, and he held it there until she stopped breathing. He stripped her clothing from her body because he was afraid of leaving DNA evidence behind. He dumped the clothes in a dumpster. He carried her body into the woods near the barn and left her there. He drove the van to the truck stop in Franklin, Tennessee, cleaned it out as best he could, and abandoned it. Then he made his way south to Huntsville, Alabama, where he stayed for about a week with a woman he had met while in prison. After that, he went back north to Pennsylvania. On August 21, 1996, less than 1 month after he had taken Morgan's life, he was arrested in Pennsylvania and returned to the Alabama prison system. Additional time was added to his sentence for the 2 escapes. He had been sitting in an Alabama prison cell since August of 1996. Less than a month after Morgan disappeared, he was already back behind bars in another state, while investigators in Kentucky and Tennessee spent the next 30 years trying to find him. Nobody had connected the escaped Alabama inmate to the missing girl in Bowling Green. The cases lived in different state systems. There was no thread between them. And so they remained 2 separate stories, until the science finally caught up. His name was Robert Scott Froberg. In early 2026, the FBI's Louisville field office submitted the hair strand one final time, to a specialized forensic laboratory using extraction methods that had not existed in 1996, or 2003, or 2011. Every previous attempt had failed for the same reason. The older techniques required an intact hair root containing nuclear DNA. This particular strand had been naturally shed from the scalp, there was no root, no follicle, no tissue. And that is exactly why it had defeated every test for 3 decades. The scientists who tried before weren't working with inferior methods for their time, they were simply working in a window before the necessary science had been developed. There was no way through with what existed. The new methods work on an entirely different principle. Rather than needing a root, they extract genetic material from inside the hair shaft itself, pulling DNA from anywhere along the length of the strand, regardless of whether a root is present. The laboratory extracted a complete genetic profile from the 30-year-old hare and built a set of genetic markers strong enough to run against Cody's, the national database that had been waiting, unknowingly, with the answer the whole time. The database returned a match. An Alabama inmate. 62 years old. Serving time for the armed robbery he had committed in 1988 and for the 2 escapes that followed. His DNA had been collected under Alabama's mandatory sampling program for convicted offenders and entered into the federal system years earlier. The profile sitting in Cody's matched the profile extracted from the hare in that abandoned maroon van. Robert Scott Froberg. The hare from the van was his. On February 24, 2026, a Bowling Green detective and an FBI special agent traveled to Montgomery, Alabama, and sat down with Froberg at the FBI field office there. With the assistance of the Alabama Department of Corrections, Froberg had been transported from his prison to the interview location. He was told why he was there. He waived his Miranda rights. He waived his right to an attorney. And he confessed. Immediately. And in extraordinary detail. He described stealing the van less than a mile from his parents' house in Dayton. He described driving it south through Kentucky on Interstate 65. He described pulling off the exit to buy drugs. He described driving into the Colony Apartments parking lot and seeing children outside in the summer heat. He described grabbing Morgan from the sidewalk, throwing her into the van, driving south into Tennessee with her fighting and screaming in the seat beside him. He described telling her he was taking her to her father, trying to stop the crying. He described the barn near White House, Tennessee. He described climbing into the back of the van. He described exactly what he did to that 7-year-old child. He told investigators he had stripped her clothing because he was afraid of leaving DNA evidence behind. He provided details that matched physical evidence from the crime scene, evidence that had never been released to the public, details that no one outside law enforcement could have known. On February 27, 2026, United States Attorney Kyle Baumgardner stood at a podium inside the Bowling Green Police Department and made the announcement that an entire community had spent 30 years waiting to hear. Robert Scott Froberg had been charged with kidnapping resulting in death, a federal charge, because the crime had crossed state lines from Kentucky into Tennessee. Under federal law, that charge carries either life in prison without the possibility of parole, or the death penalty. Baumgardner had grown up in Bowling Green. He had lived his whole life in the shadow of this case. He called it one that had haunted his hometown for 30 years. Then he told the room what Morgan's mother had told him the night before. Morgan was more than the worst thing that happened to her. She was a daughter. She was a little sister. She loved to dance. She loved to sing. She loved telling her older sisters she was bigger than them. He paused. Morgan, today is for you. Bowling Green Police Chief Michael Delaney stood alongside him at that podium and said the department had shared in the grief of the Violi family for nearly 30 years. Generations of law enforcement officers who had worked the case across 3 decades were in that room. And Glenn Violi was there too. He stood alongside his daughters, Heather and Nikki, the 2 girls who had been standing in that parking lot on July 24, 1996, who had waved at the man in the maroon van, who had spent 30 years carrying everything that came after. It was the first time the family had been together in years. And in that room, on that day, Heather and Nikki apologized to their father face-to-face for having doubted him. Glenn told reporters later that the moment was overwhelming. He said it took a great deal of courage for his daughters to do what they did, and that he was proud of them both. Then he turned to the wider community, the neighbors who had stopped speaking to him, the friends who had vanished, the people who had looked at him for 30 years and seen something other than the truth, and he said the only thing that a man who had waited that long for his name to be cleared could say. If you're willing to say you're sorry, Glenn Violi said, I'm willing to forgive you. He had waited 30 years for someone to believe him. Robert Scott Froberg had no connection to Morgan Violi or her family. He had never been to Bowling Green before that July afternoon. He had no ties to Kentucky, no relationship with anyone in the state, no reason to be there beyond the fact that he had pulled off an interstate to buy drugs and found himself in a parking lot where children were playing outside in the summer heat. He came through once. On a stolen van. And he took a child who had her whole life in front of her and left her in the woods in Tennessee. He was back in a prison cell within a month. And for 30 years, while Glenn Violi lost everything, while Heather and Nikki grew up with a question they couldn't answer, while Stacy couldn't put her daughter's photograph on the wall, while an entire community lived in fear that Morgan's killer might be walking among them, Robert Scott Froberg sat in an Alabama prison, unknown to every investigator who was looking for him. One strand of hair. Sealed in an evidence bag for 30 years. Tested 3 times and found wanting because the technology to read it simply did not yet exist. And then the science caught up. And then the database answered. And then a man who had spent 3 decades thinking he had gotten away with the worst thing a person can do sat down across from 2 investigators in Montgomery, Alabama, and told them everything. Morgan Jade Violi was 7 years old. She was born November 3, 1988, in Bowling Green, Kentucky. She loved to laugh. She loved to dance. She loved to sing. She loved telling her older sisters she was bigger than them even though she was the youngest. She wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. The last thing her sisters saw was a maroon van pulling away. Now they know who was driving it. And now, 30 years too late and not one moment too soon, Morgan finally has her answer. If this story moved you the way it moved us, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to True Crime Traces, drop a comment below telling us what part of this case stayed with you, and hit that like button so this story reaches the people who deserve to know Morgan's name. Every case we cover is a real person. Every name matters. We'll see you on the next one.